Hi all, and welcome to Let's Read Is God a Delusion by Eric Reitan. In this series, I will be reading and responding to this Christian apologetics book from my sceptical lay perspective. I am not an expert in any of the fields relevant to this book, although I do have a fondness for philosophy and counter-apologetics. In this video, I'm going to cover the introduction of the book. As suggested by the title, the book is, in part, a response to Richard Dawkins' 2006 book, The God Delusion. The introduction opens by referring to Dawkins' professed astonishment that there even exists intellectually sophisticated religious people. Whether this quote is accurate or not, Riton argues that it's not just Dawkins, but is a reflection of the new atheists in general, saying, his views here express a broader perplexity, a perplexity shared by other atheists, over why any morally sensitive and intellectually responsible adults would believe in God. Riton goes on to refine and clarify these ideas later in the introduction, but for now this is a fair summary of the new atheist position. What it misses, though, is that this is the conclusion of their position, not an assumption. That is, that since there are no good reasons for believing that God exists, and that religion has often been such a force for evil in the world, it seems strange that any intelligent and moral person would be religious. Ironically, Riton goes on to catalogue a number of new atheists, and in less than a page he mentions Daniel Dennett and his book Breaking the Spell, which Riton even notes is an attempt to understand why people are religious. That is, it is, in part, an explanation for why intelligent and moral people are religious, given that religion is false and often immoral. But Riton dismisses this, criticising Dennett with this. The possibility that religion might be directed towards a reality inaccessible to science, that belief in a transcendent God of love might be true, is not a matter Dennett finds worthy of serious attention. He thinks that the arguments for God's existence are weak, dispensing with them in a scant 6 pages. Exactly. Theists have been making arguments for the existence of God for literally millennia, and all have failed. It's not absurd to dismiss the idea of a transcendent spiritual reality, as despite many of humanity's greatest minds attempting to prove its existence, we have no good reason for believing in it. And let's be clear here. Not all new atheist books are aimed at answering the question of whether God exists. Dennett's book was not, and so devoting little time to the question was hardly a failing. Riton goes on to catalogue a number of new atheist books, including Sam Harris's various books, Victor Stenger's God the Failed Hypothesis, and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great. He does a reasonable job of surveying the wave of popular atheist books that came out around 2006, although he makes odd criticisms of each. For example, he describes Victor Stenger as having less rhetorical flair than Dawkins and less eloquence than Harris, as if this is somehow relevant to Stenger's ideas. He also bemoans that The God Delusion is far more popular than what he considers the thoughtful and meticulous work of William Rowe, who is an academic philosopher of religion, somehow missing that part of Dawkins' appeal is that he targets popular religion and writes popular books for a general audience. Of course, a science communicator is going to write books that are more popular than an academic philosopher. Riton summarises the new atheism like this. What we have today is a surge of scientists and other intellectuals who have been coming out of the closet to voice not just scepticism, but overt hostility towards theistic religion, even in its most seemingly benign forms. These new atheists, as I will call them, are distinguished by their outrage. Belief in God, they tell us, is not just irrational, but dangerous, even evil. And the public, apparently hungry for such frank expressions of animosity, have been gobbling it up, turning one book after another into a bestseller. This is a pretty good summary of the new atheist movement of 2006 or so. Riton mentions these points as if they haven't been argued for, but rather just asserted by atheists. Yes, atheists are hostile towards religion, but there are well-articulated reasons for this. And yes, we are hostile towards seemingly benign forms of religion, because too often, seemingly benign forms of religion have also caused harm, or cover for more extreme forms, or because they're founded on the same irrational faith as less benign forms. At heart, the atheist argument is pretty simple. Belief without evidence is irrational and dangerous, and we have no evidence for God. But Riton seems to be missing this underlying argument, and focusing on its expression, the hostility towards religion. He does try to account for the success of the new atheism, and he lays this primarily with the religious motivations of the 9/11 hijackers, the religious right in the US, and the creationists' undermining of science education. This desultory roundup of likely suspects hardly does justice to the many deconvertees from religion and the myriad reasons for the rise of atheism. Thankfully, Riton acknowledges this, saying, "I will leave the historical and sociological explanations to others more schooled in these disciplines." He summarised what he thinks are the main arguments, he calls them attacks, that atheists are making. 1. All the traditional arguments for God's existence are very bad ones. 2. Despite claims to the contrary, science can investigate the existence of God, and when such a scientific investigation is pursued, we see that God's existence is highly improbable at best. 3. The existence of religious belief can be satisfactorily explained without making any reference to a supernatural reality. 4. We do not need religion to provide us with a basis for morality or to give meaning to our lives. 5. Religion is dangerous, even in its moderate forms, because it encourages blind faith that is immune to both rational criticism and to the urgings of conscience. 6. Religion is a source of division and enmity among people, needlessly magnifying the violence of the world. This, again, is a fair summary of the assertions that atheists make, but it ignores their arguments. And so it also misses the logical connections between them, reducing them to nothing but a laundry list or manifesto. In reality, each of these points have been extensively argued for in full-length books by multiple authors. As long as we restrict our meaning of God to refer to a mainstream idea of the Christian God, and religion to refer to theistic religion, these points are nearly undeniable. The only arguments against these ideas that I'm aware of either redefine God or religion differently, or strawman these claims. Credit here to Riton for presenting these points in an accurate manner, rather than strawmanning the atheist position. Riton then goes on to explain that this book is a sustained effort to clear up Dawkins' perplexity as to why any intelligent, morally sensitive people would believe in God. But this misses that atheists in general, and I suspect Dawkins in particular, are not actually perplexed by this, as he has already stated before. Point 3 was that religious belief can be satisfactorily explained, and indeed Dennett devoted an entire book to doing pretty much that. So what is Riton's goal with this book then? He puts it like this. My aim is not to convince atheists and agnostics that they should believe in God, but rather to show that those who do believe in God are not thereby irrational and morally defective. Contrary to the angry arguments of the new atheists, I will argue that allegiance to theistic religion is entirely consistent with being a decent, reasonable person. But I think that, in our ambiguous and mysterious world, equally rational people can believe different things. On my view of rationality, the fact that a reasonable person could be a theist does not preclude that a reasonable person might also be an atheist. Agnostics should not expect to find arguments here that aim to compel them to accept God's existence. But I do hope they will be convinced that the decision to embrace theistic religion can be both rational and benign. This makes this book very different from other apologetics books, in that it isn't even ostensibly about convincing atheists that they are wrong. But even though that he's not aiming to convert people, he does think it's possible to convince us that theism is reasonable. This is problematic, as it goes against how we usually understand rationality. Most understandings of what it means to be rational ensures that two rational people with access to the same evidence will reach the same conclusions. This generally comes from the objectivity of logic and the existence of an objective reality. In principle, we all have access to the same evidence, and as long as we agree on how logic works, we should all come to the same conclusions. So if Riton has good reason to believe in God, then this should be good reason for me to believe in God. What I think Riton is going to argue is that subjective religious experiences can justify belief, but aren't compelling to others. While I disagree with this, I'll wait until he actually makes an argument before explaining my objections. The other possibility is that he's simply arguing that while in principle we should all agree, the reality is that differences in our experiences mean that such agreement is not practical. He seems to be hinting at this when he refers to our ambiguous and mysterious world, which suggests that our inability to reach consensus is the result of practicalities rather than principles. But the solution to this is simply to accumulate further evidence and explicate our arguments more clearly. Such difficulties have not plagued science, where even deeply counterintuitive theories like quantum mechanics and relativity are accepted by almost everyone. So I have concerns about whether it is actually possible for Reitan to convince me that it is rational for someone else to believe something that I wouldn't accept as rational. But as this is the introduction, we'll have to wait until he actually makes his arguments before I can respond properly. I just want to flag it for later. This section introduces Reitan's inspiration for this book, the 18th century theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, whose main focus was on reconciling Enlightenment values with Christianity. Schleiermacher actually makes a decent inspiration for Reitan here, since he too was attempting to chart an intellectually honest path of acceptance of what early science was telling us about reality, with a faithful acceptance of Protestant Christianity. It's hard to think that he could have been that successful, given the fall into obscurity that his ideas seem to have had. But what were Schleiermacher's ideas? According to Riton, they were: his aim was not to preserve a calcified past or the dogmas that were the target of so much scorn among religion's cultured despisers. Rather, his aim was to show these cultured despisers that they had missed the point of religion. This sounds a little too close to a no true Scotsman argument. If his defence to the arguments of the new atheists is simply that they are not targeting the true Christianity, then he is very wrong. Most atheists go out of their way to make sure that they are addressing the actual beliefs that people hold. So at best, Riton will need to concede that most Christians aren't true Christians, by his definition. And so it's not that Dawkins or Harris are wrong, but rather that Riton has some super secret version of religion that only he and a few others hold to, that is yet to receive the attention of atheists. Schleiermacher apparently also recognised this. Riton says, according to Schleiermacher's understanding, religion itself is something that only a minority in history has really grasped and appreciated, while millions, in various ways, have been satisfied to juggle with its trappings. He goes on to say, on Schleiermacher's analysis, as well as my own, religious fundamentalism, at least insofar as it embraces fundamentalism, does not have the right to call itself religion at all. The God of fundamentalism has no legitimate claim on the title. What he means here is that most of what people consider religion or God does not fit within his definition, particularly any reverence for a holy book or scripture. But this is an admission that the new atheists are accurate in their criticism of much of religion. The only point of disagreement between Dawkins and Riton is on whether there is still a small group of people who are rational in their religious beliefs, which apparently are based on arguments or evidence that is not necessarily available to all. This is a pretty limited claim, unlike most other apologetics books, so maybe he will be able to make a decent argument for his religion. But it is telling that not only does he clearly define what he's going to defend, but that he does it in a way that dismisses the religion of other Christians. Riton goes on to more explicitly delineate what he will and will not defend. In particular, he won't be defending biblical inerrancy, the doctrine of hell, the divine command theory of ethics, faith as stubborn belief without regard for evidence, a doctrine of religious exclusivism, patriarchal subordination of women, the heterosexist marginalisation of gays and lesbians, and young earth creationism. This paints him as a very different Christian to the majority of well-known apologists, and Riton himself describes it as, when I describe my faith to my students, calling myself Christian strikes many as akin to describing an 18-legged purple animal with an elephantine nose and then calling it a horse. He goes on to claim that his main goal with this book is to clearly explicate what he means by religion and God, and to defend only these ideas, or territory. As he puts it, what should become clear is that many actual religions tread shamelessly outside this territory, into the domain of superstition and ideology, and when they do so, they render themselves appropriate fodder for Dawkins' attacks. Dawkins' mistake is not that he attacks these runaway religions. His mistake is to blithely assume that theistic religion itself falls prey to these attacks. It does not. The problem with this is that Dawkins, and other atheists, don't blithely assume that their arguments apply to all religion. They start from fairly incontestable qualities of religion, like a belief in the supernatural or the value of faith, and then show why this is irrational. And Riton has acknowledged as much in this very paragraph. He started by noting that he will defend the tenets of his belief that Dawkins does actually attack. So on one hand, he acknowledges that his version of religion is susceptible to atheist arguments, but on the other hand, he wants to argue that his religion is immune to such criticism. Riton goes on to explain that he takes issue as much with fundamentalist Christianity as he does with the new atheists, saying that he had originally intended this book to be targeted at the religious right. It seems that the success of the God delusion prompted him to change course and instead focus on atheism. He then explains again some of the points on which he agrees with the new atheists, particularly their criticisms of religious faith. He puts it like this: I share with the new atheists their disdain for those who stubbornly cling to religious beliefs for no reason at all, without regard for arguments or evidence, with no thought to the implications of their beliefs or the objections that might be levelled against them. This kind of stubborn attachment to religious beliefs is what Dawkins and Harris call faith. This is a straw man of most atheist positions. The worst kind of faith is exactly what has been described here, but that's not the only problematic kind of faith. A more accurate statement of what most atheists would consider faith is something akin to any degree of belief beyond what you have evidence for. That is, faith is not following Hume's advice to apportion one's belief to the evidence. So it need not be stubborn insistence on something for which you have no evidence. It could just be believing strongly in something for which you have weak evidence, or thinking something unlikely that actually has good evidence for it. All of these are examples of the kind of faith that atheists think is bad, as it is irrational. Just because we often focus on the most extreme examples of religious faith doesn't mean that the more mild versions aren't also to be fought against. Riton then gives us a glimpse of the thesis of his book, summarising it like this: It is my conviction that theism and other forms of supernatural religion are born out of a combination of rational insight, profound experiences of a distinctive kind, and morally laudable hope. But along with Schleiermacher, I believe that the germ of religion born from these sources needs to be refined and shaped by careful and humble reflection in open-minded discourse with others. He goes on to explain that this combination of factors gives rise to a seed of what he calls true religion. He has the grace to have some embarrassment at such a dismissal of every other religion, but his idea is that most other religions co-opt this seed of true religion, pervert it and twist it to suit political or ideological ends. He seems to be suggesting that we each have the ability to make contact with his God, and that such a profound experience, together with the other positive values, constitutes his concept of religion. It's hardly an objectionable idea that much religious practice, both now and historically, has little to do with any god, even if one did exist. Atheists and theists would likely agree that much of the practice of religion, especially other people's religions, are not divinely inspired, but rather are the works of humans. The only point of disagreement is whether underneath all of the human-made trappings of religion there is a genuinely divine experience, or whether it is all mundane. I look forward to seeing Riton's evidence. This section opens with Riton again returning to the question of why intelligent and moral people would believe in God. He criticises the atheist view that these people are religious in spite of their intelligence and morality, or as he puts it, it must be because their intelligence and moral sensitivity have, at this point, failed them. I probably wouldn't phrase it that way. Instead, I'd say that they are selectively applying their intelligence and moral sensitivity. Riton criticises this conclusion, arguing that atheists are too hasty to dismiss the existence of God as an explanation for intelligent theists, arguing it like this: Can the fact that there are theists who seem to be intelligent and morally sensitive be explained on the assumption that these theists are exercising their intelligence and moral sensitivity in the formation of their theistic beliefs? For Dawkins to assume that the answer is no, and for him to declare it must be selective stupidity, just because he hasn't been able to figure out how the exercise of intelligence and moral sensitivity can generate religious belief, well, why isn't that intellectually irresponsible? The short answer is because that's not what Dawkins, or other atheists, are actually doing. It's not that we have no explanation for why good people are religious, as we actually have many. And it's not that anyone is assuming that it cannot be because they are using their intelligence in forming their beliefs. What atheists are actually arguing is that there is no rational basis for believing in God, not as an a priori assumption, but as a reasonable conclusion after looking at all the evidence and arguments for God. Since no theist has managed to put forth a compelling case for God, we can reasonably conclude that anyone who does believe in God does so for irrational reasons. Therefore, intelligent people who are religious aren't exercising their intelligence when they believe in God. That's why that's not intellectually irresponsible. And what Riton is doing here is bordering on circular logic. I could be misreading him, but he seems to be setting up the argument that some reasonable people believe in God, therefore there must be good reasons for believing in God, therefore those people are being reasonable when they believe in God. It gets him nowhere if he cannot demonstrate that these people actually believe for good reasons, or that good reasons exist. Given the poor argumentation he's giving here, I worry. He goes on to criticise Dawkins as being unqualified to conduct research into whether theists have a rational basis for their beliefs, comparing him to intelligent design proponents, who quickly give up when confronted with an unexplained phenomenon, claiming that God did it. Here he argues that Dawkins would be too quick to give up on the search for a rational basis for theistic belief, instead hastily concluding that theists must be irrational. The problem with this argument is it shifts the burden of proof terribly and misses the point badly. It is not up to atheists to discover whether theists have a rational basis for their beliefs. Unlike biology, where all knowledge has to come from investigation, on the question of whether theism is rational, we need only ask theists why they believe, which is exactly what atheists have done, and all of the responses have been irrational. Based on that, it is completely reasonable to conclude that it's unlikely that there is a rational basis for faith. And unlike the intelligent design advocate, who can make the empty challenge of prove that this feature evolved, theists should actually be in a position to prove that their beliefs are rational. It seems dishonest to agree with Dawkins that almost everyone who is religious is so for poor reasons, to hold that true religion is rare, and then criticise Dawkins for concluding that since seemingly every reason for religious belief is irrational, there probably aren't any rational justifications. Unless and until this book gives a good reason for thinking that theism can be reasonable, I'll continue to think it isn't, based on all the other examples of theists claiming their beliefs are reasonable and then turning out not to be. Riton then goes on to lose further credibility by doing some equivocation about faith. He says about scientists, they have faith in the power of science to explain events, not in the naive sense of faith that Dawkins and Harris foist upon religious believers, but in a very real sense of the word. For scientists, their faith is a kind of methodological presumption that a naturalistic explanation is available, if only we keep at it long enough. It is, in a sense, a species of hope. Faith, in the sense of hope not based on evidence, is irrational. And that's not what scientists generally have, even pioneering scientists from history. The belief that the universe is ordered and that the rules that govern it are discoverable are entirely reasonable extrapolations from not only our daily experiences, but also from our history. And the scientific endeavour does not run on irrational hope. Individual scientists may well have faith in that sense, but science advances by investing time and effort in areas where results are reasonably expected. Ideally, there is no hope or faith in science. Instead, there is a reliance on purely rational expectation of results based entirely on evidence and past experience. This conflating by Riton of rational expectation with faith or hope is a typical apologist strawman or misunderstanding. Riton next outlines the qualities that he sees in people that he thinks have what he calls true religion. And it's the good liberal archetype, optimistic, forgiving, calm, and open to discussion. He argues that these people bring their intelligence and morality to their religious beliefs. He then makes the following observation. To say that the religious faith of these rare individuals springs from their intelligence and moral sensitivity is not to say that they all have carefully worked out philosophical arguments demonstrating the reasonableness of theistic faith. Their intellects and compassion may operate on a more intuitive level. It's a job of philosophers to trace out carefully the rational pathways that intuitive insight often surges through too quickly for plodding intellects to follow. This is redefining the notion of having a rationally held belief. The idea that you can intuitively arrive at a belief without explicit rational justification and still call that a reasonable position utterly destroys one of the hallmarks of rational belief. It means any belief that we arrive at intuitively can be called rational. For him to say that such beliefs can be said to be a result of our intelligence is equivocating on what we mean by intelligence. When we talk about theistic beliefs being at odds with intelligence, we mean intelligence in the sense of rationality. So to claim that such beliefs can come from someone's intelligence but not their rationality, I'm not sure what that means. He seems to be suggesting that one can come to a belief that is later confirmed by rational argument. But a belief is not rational until you have that justification. Being right for the wrong reasons is still irrational, and I look forward to how Riton will explain this. The final section of the introduction is simply an overview of the content of this book. I won't cover it in detail here, as we'll get to each of these topics as we go through the chapters in detail. The two things that stand out for me are statements he makes about his arguments for God and the problem of evil. He again repeats that he does not think that his arguments for the existence of a God actually prove that a God exists, but that they show it is reasonable to believe in the existence of a necessary being, by which he means a creator deity. As I've said before, I'm not sure that there is a gap between arguments that all rational people should find compelling and arguments that no rational person should find compelling. It seems a very fine sliver of argumentative power to be rationally compelling only to the person making the argument, but no one else. The other point that grabbed my attention is that he intends to defend his God against the problem of evil. He doesn't actually tell us what his defence is, but he does argue that the amount of evil in the world is so much that only faith in God can render our lives meaningful. This seems like a big admission that the problem of evil is a big problem for believers in a good God. But if this is the only point he has, then it's an argument from consequences. Okay, so that's it for the introduction. And I must say, I found it frustrating. As someone who is politically liberal, it's nice to encounter a theist who I agree with on most political issues. I was also initially heartened by his ability to accurately portray the points that atheists make. And at first I found that when he stated atheist arguments too strongly, he would subsequently clarify them. But as the introduction went on, he seemed to do less of this and slipped into presenting straw men. This is disappointing. Even when he did present the points that atheists make well, he rarely examined their reasons for these positions. So he, perhaps inadvertently, presented atheists as holding these points as dogma rather than reasoned positions. The other frustration was his focus on Richard Dawkins. I understand that this book is supposed to be a response to the God Delusion, but that's not a very accurate description of what he has presented. So far, he's presented his own position that largely agrees with Dawkins' criticism of mainstream religion. You could summarise this introduction as saying, Dawkins is absolutely correct in his criticisms of the vast majority of religious people and religious practices, but I hold to a very unusual faith that is immune to his criticisms because it works on different definitions. It also bothered me that he would snipe about the quality of writing of various atheist authors as if it was relevant. In all, he seems to have something of a grudge against these atheists, despite agreeing with them on far more than he agrees with most religious people. At this point, we've only got through the introduction, but I consider it a bad sign that a professional philosopher can skirt so close to a number of logical fallacies without recognising how suspect his arguments sound. He refers to his version of Christianity as true religion. He agrees at length with the criticisms of religion, but then argues that atheists don't really understand what they're arguing against. He unabashedly invokes religious experience, intuition, and hope as supporting his arguments for the existence of God, seemingly without recognising the problems that such an approach has. While I'm not saying he doesn't have explanations for this, and we will find out as we read the book, I am saying that it makes me suspicious at this point. One thing he has done well is make it clear what he is going to be arguing for. In the next chapter, the first, he will be arguing for his definition of religion. We'll see how that goes next week. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what your thoughts are on the book so far, and until next week, see ya.